Some will tell you Pelé was the best who ever played, taking Brazil to two World Cup finals before stepping up to help his nation win both tournaments in decisive fashion. Others will claim he scored 1,000 goals against amateur players while touring rural Brazil in a brilliant Santos team that passed him goal scoring opportunities on a plate. The third take, and this is the one that holds water best, is that there's absolutely no reason these things have to be mutually exclusive. Football has always been riven with debates about who can claim to be the greatest of all time. Whether you're a Maradona apologist, a Pelé man, part of the CR7 army, not a real thing, or one of those who worships at the altar of Messi, this is a real thing at the Camp Nou. Heck, maybe you're one of those fans who's willing to stake something on Neymar even at this point. Ultimately, it's a subjective and pointless debate, and happily, Pele, a documentary produced for Netflix that features the player himself in extensive interviews, does not go down this route. With archive footage and interview, the documentary avoids the hype and explores the real Pelé. In March 2020, he announced, with all the confidence of a man who spoke about himself in the third person, about being compared to Ronaldinho, Beckenbauer, Cruyff, Zico, Ronaldo, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Messi, Pelé was better than them all. Great at scoring goals, less good at humility. Occasionally, people dismiss him as a little bit chippy when he gets involved in this "who's the greatest" argument, explained Pele's co-director David Trihorn. There's an immense pride in terms of what he achieved, ultimately the rubber stamp of cultural and national identity for his nation. He will get a little upset if that's forgotten. Trihorn and his co-director Ben Nicholas's film followed Pelé from his childhood in São Paulo State to the 1970 World Cup final against Italy, which Brazil won, courtesy of 4 goals from the most iconic international football team ever assembled. Gerson, Tostão, Rivellino, Jairzinho, and Pelé all played in the final. Pelé scored the opening goal, and the film sets Pelé up as an avatar for Brazil as a nation, a sort of living foundation myth the country had been waiting for until the 1950s. In 1958, Brazil emerged as a footballing power by winning the World Cup against the home team in Sweden, becoming the first non-European team to win in Europe. Pelé was the youngest goal scorer ever in a final, at just 17. Meanwhile, his goal in the 1970 final marked his retirement from international football. His 2 wins perfectly bookend Brazil's first golden age of football. When he's feeling good, Brazil is feeling good, or vice versa, said Nicholas, and somehow, for better or worse, the story we show is the two of them having this relationship between 1958 and 1970. Pelé was envisioned as a 1950s Hollywood studio system star, a sporting answer to Elvis Presley. Pelé also told a now standard footballer origin story. Before he was Pelé, the young Edson Arantes do Nascimento became a shoe shiner to help his family when his father, who was also a footballer, was injured and his club stopped paying him. Pelé's grandparents transported wood via horse and cart for a living, and he spent much of his childhood playing with homemade footballs. We came from nothing, and we had very little, he explained in the film. The same could be said of Brazil itself, which in the 1950s was not regarded a footballing nation. It's incredible now to think of it, but there wasn't even a national league. Football was only played at state level. The national poet Nelson Rodrigues came up with a term to describe what he saw as the contemporary Brazilian mentality: the mongrel complex, a defeatist attitude. Pelé, the film declares, was the rebuttal to this mentality. As if to prove it, everyone from Pelé's sister to then Brazil manager Mario Zagallo, to Jairzinho himself, to the former president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, took their place in front of the camera in Pelé to talk about Pelé's greatness. They were full of praise for him, mostly. Though, like Asif Kapadia's excellent Maradona documentary in 2019, the film avoids becoming a hagiography. Instead, they recount the story of the real Pelé. First up for scrutiny is the near mythological status Pelé enjoyed in Brazilian and global culture, and the way media and technology combined to make him a star. Using swathes of archive footage of the player grinning for cameras, signing autographs, and getting on and off planes, Tryhorn and Nicholas explored how Pelé was the first footballer who had a truly global appeal, because he arrived just as the technology fell into place to be one. Nicholas pointed out that with the advent of widespread air travel in the 1960s, Santos could fly Pelé and the squad around the world to play exhibition matches against AC Milan and Real Madrid and beat them. The directors envisioned Pelé as a 1950s old Hollywood studio system star, a sporting answer to Elvis Presley or Marilyn Monroe, and his rise perfectly coincided with the early televisation of football, previously only broadcast on radio. His peak as a player and a global personality at the 1970 World Cup in Mexico was the first to be shown in color around much of the world. A huge part of the mythology is that yellow shirt under the Mexican sun, said Nicholas. Take that away, and suddenly it's a bit weaker. The difference between Pelé and Elvis, of course, is that Elvis isn't around to talk to documentarians. Pelé, who was 80 years old at the time, walks into the frame with a Zimmer frame at the beginning of the film. But he was the documentary's most important on-screen storyteller. It took Tryhorn and Nicholas 8 months of negotiation with Pelé's management to get into the room with the man himself. But once they did, they sat and spoke to him for hours, teasing out memories of his childhood and adolescence. Every time he's left the house for the last 65 years, he has had a microphone pushed in his face, said Nicholas. So he has maybe created these stock answers to get himself through interviews. It was about working through those and then saying to him, we want to do something deeper. The result is a pleasingly frank assessment of Pelé's life and career. When it comes to this on-pitch legacy, he never budged an inch. Why would he? But he did talk openly about how his various affairs ruined his first marriage. Pelé had 7 known children by 4 different women, and possibly others. But far more controversial was his involvement with the right-wing authoritarian junta that ruled Brazil from 1969 to 1985, which he also spoke about. Here, the documentary intercuts footage of Pelé smiling and shaking Medici's hand with shots of water cannon, police charging rioters on horseback, and dead and injured protesters. Pelé remained studiously apolitical in public for decades, at least as far as being apolitical as possible under a dictatorship, and while the documentary treats his decision as an understandable response to a very real threat, Pelé's talking heads were not all so generous. Caju, who played alongside Pelé for Brazil in 1970, described him as an Uncle Tom, a black man who never questioned authority. Others negatively compared him to Muhammad Ali. Meanwhile, the journalist Juca Kfouri defended Pelé by pointing out, Ali risked prison for refusing the draft, fine, but Pelé risked state-sanctioned murder if he spoke out. If I told you I didn't know anything about the disappearances and torture, I would be lying, admitted Pelé. But, he argues, he and his Santos teammates knew nothing for certain. Media was tightly controlled by the government, and they spent long periods playing abroad. And he could achieve more for the Brazilian people on the pitch than by trying to take on the entire Brazilian state security apparatus. Pelé's achievements merge with national glory, whoever wins, explained Cardoso, the ex-president. A dictatorship? It wins with him. A democracy? It wins in the same way. For Pelé, who was 23 when the junta took power and who had little formal education, it was too much to grapple with. Tryhorn takes the old Hollywood studio star analogy a step further. What he knows is smiling for the cameras, signing autographs. When we have the 1960s, a decade of change, he almost can't quite keep up with that. And when the world becomes a bit more radical, he doesn't really know how to get on board. When Diego Maradona died in 2020, a number of obituaries highlighted his status as a Latin American champion, a staunch Argentine socialist who stood up against Yankee American imperialism and a personal friend of Castro and Chavez. But for most of his career, Maradona lived and played in Italy or Spain. Pele, committed to staying in his beloved Brazil and driving the national game forward, had no such option. It's also perhaps worth noting here that in the 1960s, Brazil's regional leagues were as competitive as Europe's national ones, so Pelé was hardly shirking competition. Maradona would have seen the Muhammad Alis of the world, said Nicholas, and would have seen the Black Panther salute at the 1968 Olympics, and would have maybe attached himself to the idea of, I want to be a rebel, that's my style. Pelé didn't have that option. Pelé was totally inextricable from Brazilian football as an institution, for better or worse. Early on in Pelé, an English news reporter at the 1970 World Cup accidentally sums the situation up the best, declaring that he's worshipped to the point where he's almost a prisoner. Trihorn felt that during their interviews, Pelé was uncomfortable talking about anything political. At times, he seemed almost bemused by the idea that he should or could have taken action. Instead, in one of the best moments in the documentary, the first time we see Pelé really relax is at a barbecue with his old Santos teammates, now all in their 70s and 80s. Pelé is late and his teammates start cracking jokes about how O-Ray, the king, always keeps them waiting. And then he walks around the corner and the old men are suddenly young players again. We see Pelé as such a guy in a suit these days, explains Trihorn, an establishment figure. He and Nicholas wanted to show him as a t-shirt, shorts, and flip-flops guy, at least momentarily. At first, Pelé took some convincing when they suggested the barbecue. I think he finds it quite hard meeting up, all those emotions coming to the surface again. But once he agreed, he just fell back into character with ease, 29 again, and on top of the world. Afterwards, we were told by his manager that he still talks about that meeting. Getting together has been the absolute highlight of his last year. It's a genuinely touching moment, O'Ray and his lieutenants reliving the lofty heights of his reign one final time.